In 1987, Philip Morris, the cigarette company, took over Kraft Foods and replaced their executives with tobacco scientists. Within 3 years, those scientists made their products 80% more addictive than competitors. This isn't speculation. We have the internal documents. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at your pantry the same way. Why can't you eat just one chip? Military research in the 1970s paved the way for the engineering of ultra processed foods. Scientists working for the military discovered that specific combinations of sugar, fat, and salt tricks the brain into eating far more than normal. A landmark study was done in 2019 by the National Institutes of Health. In this study, they proved that eating ultra processed foods can cause people to eat 500 more calories a day than eating unprocessed foods, even though the nutrients, salt, and sugar levels were identical. I think we just figured out why people go to the gym and still can't lose weight. Today, we are exposing the science behind ultra processed foods and its addictive effects. We'll also discover the Bliss Point formula and how it is tricking you into wanting more, and the disturbing history of how tobacco companies perfected these deceptive tactics. Let's start where it all began. In 1971, a Harvard trained psychophysicist named Howard Moskowitz was working at a U.S. Army's pioneering research laboratory. His mission was simple: optimize food for soldiers in the field. What he discovered completely changed the food industry forever. Moskowitz discovered that people's desire for sugar increased to a certain point and then decreases, and he called this the bliss point. His research, published in the journal Science in 1974, established that humans have optimal preference not just for sugar, but for salt and fat as well. These aren't arbitrary preferences, they're hardwired neurological responses that can be measured, mapped, and exploited. By the 1980s, every major food company had teams of scientists dedicated to finding the exact points for their products. They tested thousands of formulations, adjusted ratios by fractions of a percent, and used consumer panels to identify the precise moment when a food became irresistible. But the bliss point was just the beginning. The real breakthrough came when researchers discovered what happened when you combined these elements. In 2018, researchers at Yale University made a shocking discovery. Using brain imaging technology, they found that foods combining fat, carbohydrates produce reward signals in the brain that are exponential. Dr. Dana Small and her team had participants bid on different foods while their brains were scanned with fMRI. The results were published in the journal Cell Metabolism. People were willing to pay significantly more for foods that combined fat and carbohydrates than similar food that were fat only or carbohydrate only. This is called a supra addictive effect. The brain's reward centers lit up more intensely when both macronutrients were present together. Important fact: in nature, foods rarely combine high fat and high carbohydrates. Nuts are high fat, low carb. Fruits are high carb, low fat. Our brains were created with separate reward pathways for each because they signal different nutritional benefits. But ultra processed foods deceive both pathways at the same time. Your brain doesn't know how to regulate this. The reward signal becomes overwhelming, and people in the study were worse at estimating how many calories they were eating when fat and carbohydrates were combined. This was intentional. In 2019, researcher Tera Fazzino at the University of Kansas established the first quantitative definition of hyperpalatable foods. When her team applied these research findings to the USDA food database, they found that 62% of foods in the American food supply met the definition of hyperpalatable. These aren't random occurrences. These are engineered combinations designed to make people eat more. Research by Dr. Eric Stice at Stanford found weight gain over time is associated with reduced striatum response to palatable food. Your brain's reward system is literally being dulled by repeated exposure. However, it's important to note that in January 2025, a study by Dr. Kevin Hall using PET imaging found no significant dopamine response in the striatum after consuming ultra processed milkshakes. This suggests the mechanisms may be more complex than initially thought, and the field is still working to understand exactly how these foods affect brain chemistry. What's clear is that behavioral patterns resembling addiction do occur. Now, here's where the story gets darker. In 2023, researchers published a study in the journal Addiction that analyzed documents from the University of California, San Francisco Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library. What they found was disturbing. Between 1988 and 2001, foods owned by tobacco companies were 29% more likely to be fat and sodium hyperpalatable and 80% more likely to be carbohydrate and sodium hyperpalatable than foods owned by non tobacco companies. The timeline is well documented. In 1985, Philip Morris acquired General Foods for $5.7 billion. In 1987, they launched the Corporate Synergy Project, replacing General Food executives with personnel from their tobacco divisions. In 1988, Philip Morris merged Kraft with General Foods, creating the world's largest food company with $20 billion in annual revenue. Internal documents analyzed in the American Journal of Public Health revealed direct transfer of marketing strategies from tobacco to food divisions. The same companies that spent decades engineering cigarettes to be extremely addictive while publicly denying the health consequences were now applying the same tactics to your breakfast cereal. Investigative journalist Michael Moss, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the food industry, wrote about a 1999 meeting in Minneapolis where food industry executives were warned about the coming obesity epidemic and the role their products played. The response was continuing their deceptive tactics, public denial, while privately optimizing formulations. By 2018, 57% of fat and sodium hyperpalatable foods originally introduced by tobacco companies remained prevalent in the American food supply. Tobacco companies had simply moved from cigarettes to snack foods. For years, the food industry argued that ultra processed foods weren't inherently problematic, that obesity was about total calories and personal choices, not the engineering of food. Then, in 2019, Dr. Kevin Hall at the National Institutes of Health conducted a definitive experiment that proved otherwise. 20 adults were admitted to the NIH Clinical Center and housed there for 4 weeks. They were randomly assigned to either an ultra processed diet or an unprocessed diet for 2 weeks, then switched to the other diet. Both diets were carefully matched for calories, macronutrients, sugar, sodium, and fiber. The only difference was the level of processing. The participants were allowed to eat as much or as little as they wanted. Meals were provided 3 times per day, with snacks available at all times. Every bite was weighed and recorded. The results, published in Cell Metabolism, they were absolutely crushing to big tobacco. On the ultra processed diet, participants consumed an average of 508 extra calories per day. They gained 2 pounds in 2 weeks. On the unprocessed diet, they lost 2 pounds. Do the math. At a pound per week, in 10 weeks, that's 10 pounds. Imagine that over 52 weeks, which is a full year. The increase came from both carbohydrates, an extra 280 calories per day, and fat, an extra 230 calories per day. Participants also ate significantly faster on the ultra processed diet. This wasn't about willpower or nutrition knowledge. These were healthy adults in a controlled environment with identical nutritional options. The ultra processed formulation itself was driving overconsumption. Hall's team concluded that ultra processed foods may be engineered to have supernormal appetitive properties that disrupt gut brain signaling. When food dissolves rapidly in your mouth, what food scientists called vanishing caloric density, your brain underestimates how many calories you've consumed. Products like Cheetos exemplify this engineering. They melt on contact, signaling low calories to your brain despite their actual caloric density. This study, funded by the NIH with no industry conflicts, remains the gold standard proof that ultra processed foods cause overconsumption through their formulation, not just their availability. So, which foods are the most addictive? In 2015, researchers at the University of Michigan conducted a study with 504 participants to identify which foods triggered the most addiction like eating behaviors. The results, published in PLOS One, ranked foods based on how difficult people found them to stop eating. The top 10 most addictive foods were pizza, chocolate, chips, cookies, ice cream, french fries, cheeseburgers, non diet soda, cake, and cheese. Notice the pattern? 9 of the 10 are highly processed. 9 of the 10 combine high fat with either high sugar or high refined carbohydrates in exactly the supra addictive combination identified in the Yale brain imaging research. The study found that processing level was the largest predictor in addictive like eating, followed by fat content and glycemic load. Glycemic load is a simpler way to measure how much a serving of food affects your blood sugar. Diabetics, pay attention. When researchers analyzed Oreo cookies specifically, studies have shown more active neurons in reward centers of rats' brains than cocaine. The formulation reveals the engineering precision. Per 100 grams, Oreo contained 40 grams of sugar, 20 grams of fat, and 342 milligrams of sodium. They simultaneously meet multiple hyperpalatable thresholds: fat plus sugar and carbohydrate plus sodium. This isn't food, this is a formula. Understanding this science changes everything. When you can't stop eating chips, when you finish a pint of ice cream you meant to save, when you're thinking about food 20 minutes after a meal, this isn't moral failure. Your brain is responding exactly as it was designed to respond. The problem is that these foods were designed to exploit that response. Some researchers say we shouldn't call this addiction because the food doesn't produce the same magnitude of dopamine response as what hard drugs do. That may be true, but the controlled studies prove something very problematic is going on. The fact remains Ultra processed foods are engineered using neuroscience and food chemistry to maximize consumption. They combine macronutrients in ratios that never existed in nature. They're formulated by companies that literally transferred their expertise from making addictive cigarettes. And they demonstrably cause people to eat 500 extra calories per day. Approximately 75% of American adults are now overweight or obese. The rise matches the explosion of ultra processed foods in our food supply, which now makes up nearly 60% of the average American diet. This was not accidental. This was created purposefully. Here's the good news: awareness is the first step. When you understand why you can't control overeating, you can make better decisions. You can recognize that craving isn't hunger, it's engineered neurological manipulation. Your brain hasn't failed you, the food system has.